Hello, Jennifer. While we can still see you,
Good morning. Good morning.
she likes to go incognito.
Yeah, well,
I say
she's
I like
always
to
plugged
lurk.
in.
I'm always here. Yes.
How are you?
All right. All right. Well, while everybody is getting your screen act on, I just want to say a quick word about the video we're about to see to introduce Unit 7. This video is a little bit longer than some of the ones you've seen. It's going to run about 11 minutes.
Oh,
So,
okay.
but it is a very useful introduction to the texts that we're going to see, and there are fewer texts to cover. So we'll see how much of the unit we get done today, and we're about ready. Jennifer, you want to roll it? I know it's an anachronism, but
The Maimonidean controversy refers to a centuries-long argument that began during Maimonides' lifetime and swept through southern France and Spain for a century after his death. It included excommunications, impassioned letters, polemical sermons, booklets, and propaganda, as well as clashes among competing rabbinic authorities. What was the Maimonidean controversy about? Most fundamentally, it was about the place of philosophy, shorthand for rational scientific inquiry, in Judaism. Was or is Judaism a rational religion? That is, are there good defensible reasons to hold Jewish religious beliefs? Can the existence of God, for example, be proven? Or is Judaism primarily a commitment based on faith and loyalty to a revered authoritative tradition? Is Judaism a place you go to turn off the endless critical questions that reason produces? And further, is wanting Judaism to pass muster at the bar of reason a chutzpah against God? After all, who are we to tell God what's acceptable to us? It's understandable that highly educated, questioning people might be skeptical toward received religious opinion and undecided about fundamental matters, such as whether God exists or whether the Torah is the consummate expression of divine will. Maimonides taught that religion must satisfy sound reason, and that reason, when exercised properly, could overcome doubt. For Maimonides, the ideal Jew should know a lot about natural science and philosophy. Only a well-trained mind could grasp the truths of Judaism. But his opponents didn't want to go down that road. They worried about the risks of too much rational inquiry. They insisted that educating people in a Torah-true atmosphere and putting limits on intellectual exploration would keep Jews in the fold. I don't want to imply that Judaism before Maimonides was somehow lacking in reason. The rabbinic Judaism that all parties to the conflict professed had its own internal model of rational inquiry, namely the dialectics of the Talmud. The Talmud is all about evidence, argument, criticism, and proof. Miracles make good stories for it, but they don't win legal arguments. Maimonides was a master of this culture. Nonetheless, the rationality that he championed was different. It was more subversive. It derived from the philosophy and science of Aristotle and the medieval Muslim philosophers who followed him. The Aristotelian way of thought, while not atheistic, knew nothing of a personal God, of revelation, or of divine commandments. Talmudic thought was indeed critical, but it was embedded within the highly imaginative poetic theology found in Midrash. God was very much a human-like literary character, both on a straightforward reading of the Bible as well as in rabbinic commentaries. Maimonides left that world behind. He proposed a distant, transcendent God, stripped of all human-seeming attributes, such as emotion or physical features. Maimonides' God could not be characterized by any of the terms of human language, such as great or powerful or compassionate, God was essentially unknowable. This philosophical mode of thought precluded the idea of a comforting, familiar, and personal God. Maimonides' opponents disapproved of this importation of Greek thought into Judaism. To philosophize, they felt, implied that the Torah lacked resources to make its own laws and teachings clear. The Torah is perfect. Why would one need anything else? Now, you might think that the argument over Maimonides' philosophical approach to Judaism was between enlightened people, the Maimonideans, and reactionary traditionalists, the anti-Maimonideans. But the figures who opposed Maimonidean thought, such as Rabbi Avraham ben David of Poskier, known as Rabbi, or Rabbi Shlomo ben Avraham Adret of Barcelona, known as Rashba, they were themselves moderate enlighteners. Although some anti-Maimonideans did oppose philosophy root and branch, others believed that philosophical interpretations of Judaism had merit. They just worried about how far such interpretations should go and who should be permitted to pursue them. So some anti-Maimonidean rabbis endorsed philosophy, but only for an elite few, and only because they worried that if the elite were forbidden from philosophizing, the best minds might be lost to Judaism. Overall, they feared the consequences of philosophy run amok. It might lead to skepticism and non-observance, mockery, and communal disintegration. They suspected that Maimonides and his followers did not believe in traditional religious convictions, such as bodily resurrection in the Messianic era, the creation of the world from nothing, or the miracles reported in the Bible. Maimonides' own words gave credence to their suspicions. He tells us that the Guide for the Perplexed contains a secret teaching only for the initiated. Perhaps his more pious views were mere political rhetoric for the masses. Furthermore, Maimonides' opponents feared that his penchant for viewing some traditional matters as allegory, such as anthropomorphic descriptions of God's body in the Bible, would open the floodgates to lax observance and a diminished assimilated Judaism. These worries were not unfounded. There were popular preachers inspired by philosophical approaches who minimized the need for traditional observance, given supposedly higher rational insights into what the Torah really meant. It is also important to understand that this controversy was not a purely intellectual matter. It quickly became embroiled in politics and class. How far should rabbinic authority go? Proponents of each side banned those on the other. But should bans issued by foreign rabbis apply beyond their borders? How much weight should local practice carry? Was cultural pluralism legitimate in medieval Judaism? These issues were deeply implicated in the controversy and are still alive today, evident in the many fundamental ideological and cultural gaps that exist between subcommunities of contemporary Jews, the splits between conservative and Orthodox Jews, between modern Orthodox and Haredi Jews, between secular and religious Jews, can all be seen as echoes of these unresolved questions about whether we may apply so-called external wisdom to our understanding of Torah, and about who has the authority to make such decisions. Bans and counterbans aside, the most shocking moment in the controversy came in 1233. Spurred on by anti-Maimonideans, the church burned the Guide for the Perplexed, as well as the Book of Knowledge, the foundational section of Maimonides' Code of Law, the Mishnah Torah. The intrusion of the church into the controversy brought momentary sobriety and solidarity back to the Jewish disputants. But the controversy broke out anew later in the 13th century, ending only with the expulsion of the Jews from France. The Maimonidean controversy is a rich but painful episode in Jewish history. It gets to the heart of what Judaism is or ought to be. Is Judaism first and foremost a form of fidelity and piety, marked by obedience to law and faithfulness to tradition? Is its continued survival based primarily on sentiment and deference to the old and revered? Is Judaism primarily a matter of belonging rather than believing? Or is Judaism a way of life that reveals an ultimate truth about who we are and what our place is in the universe? Is it about our pursuit of intellectual and moral excellence? To put it another way, is Judaism a precious artifact given to us to preserve, or is it a way of life that's open to us to deepen and enrich with the truths of our time? There are representatives of both camps in the Jewish world today. For some, questioning, criticism, and doubt are authentic Jewish virtues. For others, returning to a fully immersive traditional culture looks like salvation. In the broad middle, where many of us are, we might find that our own souls are conflicted. On the one hand, we might think that contemporary Maimonideans have the better approach, namely that religion and rational inquiry can and should be embraced simultaneously. We needn't leave our brains at the door to be good Jews, so to speak. On the other hand, we can also appreciate the risks of too much openness. If everything is up for grabs, if nothing is fixed and secure, how can religious commitment survive? What will keep us anchored in Judaism? It's no wonder that the questions raised by the Maimonidean controversy remain open, for their answers are of utmost consequence for how we understand Judaism.
Before I open the floor for questions, let me just give a brief summary and add a comment of my own. Boiling down this particular dispute is portrayed by Dr. Middleman as between two camps. There's the camp that says Judaism is a rational religion, and there's the camp that says, well, maybe a little bit, but it's also a matter of faith and loyalty to an authoritative tradition, which may or may not be up for discussion as to whether it is rational. Now, I'm not sure exactly why Dr. Middleman portrayed this dispute as between two camps, because at a certain point, probably in the 13th century, but maybe even a little bit earlier, there's a third camp that comes into play here. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. So anybody have questions, comments, reactions to this? Yes, Daniel.
Okay, I need to understand something on a very basic level. We're using rational, but in faith, we've got this two sides apparently, but everybody agrees that the Talmud uses rationalist tools. So we aren't looking at rational versus irrational. I'm trying to figure out exactly what we mean for this conversation when we say rational or not.
Right. So are the tools of philosophy, many of which come from outside of Judaism, are they legitimate ways of exploring and even affirming, or maybe in some cases rejecting, certain aspects of Judaism?
Well, it strikes me that mainstream Judaism, which includes the Talmud, has always done that. I don't see what the argument needs to be.
Well, because the Talmud doesn't use the philosophical tools that Maimonides brought in from Aristotle. Okay. Other comments or questions? All right, so hearing none, let me just throw in this third camp, which those of you who know some of the material that I've taught in other classes, this should not surprise you, that the third camp in here rejects both the Maimonidean position and the sort of semi-philosophical position. Oh, there might be some aspects of philosophy that you can learn from, but really you can't change what the tradition has passed down to us. The third camp is the Kabbalistic camp. And I won't advocate for that, but I will say that historically it played a very important role. And it was a total rejection of the philosophical approach. Kabbalah takes the attitude that the Torah teaches us certain things because God needs us to do certain tasks in the cosmos. And that's a function that really has nothing to do with the tools of reason. And in some cases, they are simply an add-on to the Talmudic traditions. And that, those traditions are fine on the most basic level, but if you really want to understand what Judaism is all about, what God wants us to do, then you have to go into this whole non-rational approach, which is the Kabbalistic
It strikes
approach.
me, I'm very glad you went here because I was starting to and I decided not. But there's really two camps. There's the mystical and there is the non-mystical or rational. And those are those.
Yes, and Dr. Middleman is pointing out that even within the philosophical and the quasi-philosophical camp, that there's that division as well. The interesting question for me is why he doesn't even mention the Kabbalistic part. And I think partly that's because he wants to narrow the discussion, make it a little bit more manageable. It's either that or he just happens to teach at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which has never been very friendly to the mystical side of Judaism. And it's like, oh yes, Kabbalah existed. Poo, poo, poo. So, not quite clear why he didn't do it, but I'll just take the generous assumption that he's doing it in order to make this discussion a little bit more manageable for us.
Okay.
Other questions or comments? Yes, Ronnie.
Okay. I'm very confused because I look at Judaism as a synthesis between the two camps. I see parts from both camps being incorporated in modern Judaism. Oops, just lost you.
Yes. No, I'm here.
Just screen.
Okay. So that's my comment.
Well,
I think that's probably a fair way of looking at things, that we've tried to navigate this dispute by integrating both views.
Right.
Okay. So maybe. Yes, Steve.
so I don't want to argue with Ronnie, but I want to expand what she's saying, because I don't think it's a modern thing. I think it's from the very beginning. It's always been a combination, even as the rabbi said there before, the Talmudic disposition of Talmud and everything, even then, there's certain things that they tried to justify and certain things they knew they couldn't. You call the, parah dumah, the red heifer. There's things that were always beyond understanding, even though they tried to understand what they could. And I think a lot of the questions that were posed on the screen, is it this or this or this? It's a piece of everything. I don't think we can put it into one. I don't think it's new. I think it's always been combinations and balancing. A lot of things about Judaism is not one way or the other.
I will
Yeah.
agree with Steve.
So Steve hits on something that is very important for our course, and that we've seen this in some of the other units as well. And you'll see it, as we move ahead in the course. And that is that there are many different tensions in Judaism that reflect problems that are common to many religions, if not all. And you can't necessarily resolve the tension completely. There are problems here that cannot be solved, but must be managed. And different people will come out at different points on the spectrum as to how they resolve that problem, but they can't solve it permanently for all the Jewish people. You come to some resolution for yourself, and hopefully that gives you a little bit of peace of mind and a way of relating to certain problems. The problems are not solvable. They can only be managed. Yes, Jerry.
After studying Mishnah Torah for 14 years, I kind of understood that the Rambam, he was aware of Kabbalah. I mean, he didn't discuss it a whole lot, but his books were all came from sources directly from the Torah or from the other commentaries. So he didn't make anything up, right?
No, he certainly didn't make anything up, although I think his philosophical approach is a new way of integrating certain outside philosophical forces, which were already having an impact in Jewish thought in certain circles. Maimonides is definitely not a Kabbalist. Kabbalah hasn't really been invented in the lifetime of Maimonides. But Maimonides has two kinds of work. One of them is reflective of law and tradition, and the other is philosophical. Right? And so he tries to stress that both of those paths are very important. They are essential within Judaism. He does, he doesn't reject one or the other. And again, it's much more of an integration of those pieces. Yes, other questions or comments? Carolyn? No, sorry. Anyone else? Okay, so we've kind of framed the unit a little bit. And just, want to stress one more point here, that some of the people who opposed Maimonidean thought, and this, Dr. Middleman mentions this too, they are not themselves necessarily opposed to philosophy. It's just a matter of how much of that you can take before you get into problems with skepticism about certain laws, with non-observance of certain laws, and then that poses a threat to the integrity of the community. So now we're going to go into the source material. And here we have text number 1 from Guide for the Perplexed itself. It's an example of what many of Maimonides' opponents really found objectionable in his philosophical teachings. And he talks here about contrasting views of creation, right? Very important teaching in traditional Judaism. God created the world out of nothing, right? That's the traditional view of creation in Judaism, right? Maimonides takes a philosophical look at creation, and he's prepared to follow that wherever it will go. And if he needs to, he will interpret the tradition allegorically rather than as an article of faith. So here's what he says. It should be clearly understood that our reason for rejecting the eternity of the world, in other words, to accept the idea of creation from nothing, is not to be sought in any text of the Torah which says that the world is created. The method of allegorical interpretation is no less possible or permissible in the matter of the world being created than in any other. In other words, you can always use allegory to interpret different aspects of the Torah. But we don't do that here, says Maimonides. He says, would have been permitted to do that, but we don't. Why not? First of all, he says the eternity of the world is not conclusively proved. So it is wrong to reject the texts and interpret them allegorically because you prefer a view the opposite of which might have been preferable for any number of reasons. Right? If we believed in the eternity of the world according to the principles laid down by Aristotle, that the world exists by necessity, that the nature of no thing ever changes, that nothing ever deviates from its customary behavior, this would destroy the law from its very foundation, belie automatically every miracle, make void all hopes and fears that the law seeks to inspire. Right? And he concludes, if it were proved that the world is created, all the objections of the philosophers to us would fall to the ground. If, on the other hand, they would succeed in providing a proof for its eternity according to Aristotle's view, the law in its entirety would fall to the ground and other manners of thinking would take its place. For I have made clear to you that the whole of it hangs on this one point, and therefore give it your most earnest consideration. So Maimonides rejects the idea of Aristotle that the world always existed and therefore was never created. And why does he do that? Why does he reject Aristotle here? Not because he can't interpret creation allegorically, but number one, Aristotle's argument is unproven. And number two, the doctrine of creation out of nothing is too important. You can't just let that slide. If you could give an airtight proof that the world was eternal, that's Aristotle's argument. If you could give an airtight proof for that, okay. So then we'd have to go to allegory, as at the beginning of this text, right? And just sort of reinterpret the meaning of the beginning of the Torah. Right? And then, but it's not proven. So we don't do that. Right? Comments or questions up to here? Yes, Lou.
I'm not sure if what I'm about to ask is relevant to actually the discussion we're having, but it's pretty clear. It's about creation, if not the philosophy of it. The Kabbalists adhere to creation as God and Ein Sof withdrawing himself, Tzimtzum, and allowing the world to be created. But was the world created from nothing, or was it created from part of God? And since God is infinite, there's no reduction of God in the creation.
The idea of Tzimtzum, of God withdrawing himself, it's like, the reason for that is because if God is everywhere, then there's no space for anything else. And therefore, God had to withdraw himself into, let's say, a much more limited space of some kind, which in Kabbalah is referred to the infinite source of creation, the Ein Sof. And then that is created not out of God exactly, but inserting this, changed form of God, which is, has an eternal soul, but a physical body. The soul is eternal, the body is not, right? So that's the key difference between God and human beings. So yes, it's sort of, created out of nothing, but it contains the divine essence. Does that make sense, Lou? Well, you're muted, so I can't tell if it makes sense.
Not particularly, but I don't want to tie up all of our time with it.
Well, if we have time, we can go back to that. Ronnie.
Okay, where does science factor into this?
For Maimonides, philosophy really is the highest form of science, right? Because science is that which is rational, right?
Mhm.
Which is fact-based, right? Philosophy is that which is logical. So that for, Aristotle, for Maimonides, is also fact-based. So there isn't really a big difference between science and philosophy. And in later philosophers, as science develops, the insights of science are integrated into philosophical thought. Right? I wish I could express this better. I don't have the kind of philosophical training that you would expect from, Dr. Middleman. So I hope you got, some of this from his comments at the beginning. Yes, Lou,
Can I add to the science discussion?
please.
Science begins after creation or with creation, not before creation. So if creation came from nothing, science comes after that. I don't remember, I think which pope, I think it was one of the 20th century popes, said that something similar to that, that science can study everything and look for causes of everything that happened before the Big Bang, but after the Big Bang, but before the Big Bang is not science's realm.
Yes. I think Maimonides would probably agree with that. Okay. All right. Let's go forward.
Rabbi,
Yes,
I have a comment.
please.
So it seems to me like what Maimonides is saying is we can't prove that the world has always existed. But even if we could, we shouldn't go there because that messes up having faith in our laws.
Yeah, and he
I mean,
I don't know.
paraphrasing, but-
I think he would say that if you could prove it, then you would retain the fidelity to the text of the Torah by reinterpreting it, by allegorically interpreting the creation story. But he says, since since Aristotle's doctrine is not proven, you don't have to do that. And you shouldn't.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. So let me plow ahead. Yeah. Oh, yeah, Ronnie. Go ahead.
Okay, because I'm confused. I don't know that much about Maimonides, but was he a practicing Jew?
Oh, absolutely.
Then why did he question the Torah?
Oh, he doesn't question the Torah so much. It is a matter of how you interpret the Torah.
Okay.
In other words, the fidelity to the Torah, that's always there for Maimonides. But if something in the Torah seems irrational, then it's incumbent upon us to reinterpret it so that our fidelity to the Torah is maintained.
Okay, thank you. That answers my question.
Right. Which I think is not so very different from what we do today when we reinterpret the Torah in order to make changes and justify changes in halakha. Right? So in a way, we're still doing what Maimonides advocated if and when it would be necessary. In this case, he says, since it's not necessary, it's not good either. Okay. Yes, Carolyn, unmute.
I know we want to get on, but
No, please.
does that then mean that once we have proven scientifically X, Y, or Z in the Torah is not scientifically fact, that we are obligated to find a way to, for lack of a better way, choke it down by reinterpreting it?
Yes. So the example that comes to my mind is the story in the Garden of Eden with the snake. All right. I mean, we're going to assume for our purposes that, despite what the Torah says, snakes never had a personality, the power of speech, the power to persuade, etc. All right. And so we would interpret that whole text allegorically. And I think it's likely that Maimonides, at least if he were sitting with us today, he would do the same thing. Okay?
Works for me. Yeah.
Yeah, good. Well, I want this to work at least for somebody. So, yeah. But again, just, remember that these disputes are part of a larger dispute that still is at issue in the Jewish world today. So again, in the Orthodox world, there are people who just pay no attention to the Guide for the Perplexed, right? They'll read Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, and Maimonides is respected because he's knowledgeable, he teaches halakha, he's the great eagle, right? Whose wings cover the entirety of the Jewish tradition. But they just don't pay attention to that philosophical stuff because they don't need that, right? But maybe you do need a philosophical approach if you don't accept some of those assumptions about the veracity of certain things in the Torah. Okay? Yes, Daniel.
I hate to be slow like this, but so we should not equate or even synonyms rationality, philosophical, and science as being pretty much the same thing. Because I thought Ronnie's line of thought was very interesting because I've been thinking in terms of rational approach to Judaism as being a scientific lens that you're looking at understanding the Torah. So
yeah,
I'm beginning to think that those aren't synonymous.
They're not exactly synonymous, but I don't want to push anybody to split hairs too much between them. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions or comments? All right. But I think that you guys are beginning to see the kind of the ground rules in this dispute, right? Let's take a look at text number 2. And this is from one of the philosophers in the 13th century, Falakera, who was mentioned briefly by Dr. Middleman. And he tries to flesh out this debate between the scholar and the pietist. Scholar is here used as code language for the philosopher, right? He said, the scholar said, I shall ask you to make known to me what you see in my ways, that you decree to me to be among the rebels, what wrong you find in me that you suspect me among the infidels. In other words, why are you reading me out of the camp? Why are you reading my views on Judaism as outside the pale? The pietist replied, far be it from me to attribute wrong to your actions. Heaven forfend that I should call the perfection of your deeds imperfect. I see you humble and wholly without imperfection. You're going to see that that's not really true. You are the disciples of Aaron, pursuing peace, loving people, bringing them close to the Torah. That's a whole quote from Pirkei Avot. Okay? You are meticulous about every commandment, the light one as well as the weighty one. However, big however here, there is one fault which putrefies the aroma of your integrity, one sin which destroys your good. It seems likely to me that this sin will cause you to lose your place in the world that is forever long and will place you in Tophet, which is prepared for the wicked. We won't go into, how we get to Tophet.
I love it when people don't really say how they think,
Yeah. Yeah, this guy is, you know, he seems very sweet on, you know, in the first part of this, and then he tells you what he really thinks. And the scholars is, "O pietist, how you multiply your words against me in your mercy. Inform me of this sin. If it is as you say, I will confess it after I abandon it. And I will beseech you to teach me how I should atone for it, what sacrifice I should bring because of this error, whether a ram or a first-year lamb." The pietist says, "Oh, I will show you, you philosopher." Yes, I'll show you. You mix the words of the Epicureans and the heretics with the right words of the Torah. You engage in the study of the irreligious books and the compositions of the Greek philosophers. What greater sin could you pursue? The words of all of these are a stumbling block to those who read them and a snare. Are they not what make humans go astray from their God and give the lie to the covenant of the law and cause them to cry out against heaven and to be a heretic? In other words, I just had this teeny tiny complaint against you, which totally destroys you. The scholar replied, "Far be it from me to consider any of their words that go against our Torah, let alone to believe that which contradicts our faith. Rather," and here's the key term in his case, "I believe of their words only that which I see to be true and in agreement with our religion. I eat the fruit of the pomegranate and throw away the peel." Now that's a phrase that's taken out of the Talmud, right? The pietist replied, "This path is not straight. Since the philosophers deny the Torah, it is improper to engage in the study of their books or to look into their words at all." All right? So the sin is, you shouldn't be reading these books at all. This is bittul Torah. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of time that you could be using to study Torah, and it's only going to draw you away from a proper Jewish life, a proper view of Torah, etc., etc. And so his response is, you know, I eat the fruit, I throw away the peel. I take what I can get from it, and I discard the rest. And that informs my Judaism and therefore is important and valid for me. Yes, Jerry. Jerry, you're on mute. So.
Okay,
Try
so
again.
we have
That's
these
not there.
we have these two people. We have Maimonides, perhaps, and then we've got this other guy, right?
Falakera.
Okay, did they ever meet each other?
No, Maimonides lived, maybe a century before.
Oh,
So,
But that's,
So-
but that's Jewish,
Well,
for them to have this debate anyway, because the Talmud is filled with debates between people who didn't live together, because the editor throws their teachings together.
If you believe in
I'm
Kabbalah, they could have
interested.
met each other.
What, Steve?
If you believe in Kabbalah, they could have met each other somewhere.
No, but I'm very interested how he starts off being sweet, and then all of a sudden he turns on the guy. You know,
Yeah,
in
he's
today's
preparing the
world,
news.
no, in today's world, I think I was come right out and say, this whatever you're teaching is nonsense. I don't want to hear it. Why do I flatter you, tell you you're a wonderful person, but don't pay attention to you?
Yeah.
Right?
You better them up first.
Yes,
right. It's
Yeah.
buttering them up.
the better to chew him up.
Yeah, but
I
the
like
point
you
is that
pointed
they
out.
never saw each other, and so that isn't that kind of a situation where you're insulting people going against all some of the Jewish laws about don't say, always say something nice about everybody.
Okay, but let's leave that aside because, there are certain things that you can justify saying and doing if your opponent is a threat to the integrity of the faith.
All right.
And therefore, it's better to just tell everybody what you think and make sure that they also put him outside the pale.
Okay, so coming to today, who do we read? We read Rambam. We don't read whatever this other guy put
Well,
out.
we do. I mean, Maimonides certainly is way more famous than Phalakera, right? But it doesn't mean that nobody reads him or that his position doesn't have a counterpart. I mean, as I said before, the way that right-wing orthodoxy works today is they believe much like Phalakera in relation to Maimonides' philosophical teachings, except that they basically ignore them. They say, you don't need that stuff. It's just going to mislead you.
Mhm.
Don't pay any attention to it. Mishnah Torah, you should study Mishnah Torah all your life, right? 14 years is not enough, right, Jerry? Yeah.
Many books.
Yeah. And there's plenty of other, legitimate Torah books to read, right? So don't pay any attention to that philosophical stuff. Don't pay any attention. Don't waste your time with the Guide for the Perplexed. It's just, it's not helpful. That's the approach they take today, rather than like Phalakera to suggest that somehow Maimonides is a heretic. He doesn't say that, of course, because he's too, the world at that time was much too respectful of Maimonides. And I think that's why in the ultra-Orthodox community today, they've taken the approach to Maimonides that they do, because they don't want to come out and say that Maimonides is a heretic. That's too radical, because Maimonides is too great a figure. But they say that, for our purposes, he's not relevant. You don't need him. Okay, other comments or questions before we go on? All right, we got a couple of minutes. We're gonna go to text number 3. And just a little bit about this piece. It is from Judah Al-Fakar, right? He is a leader in the Jewish community of Toledo in Spain, a physician to the Castilian king. And he is he is writing a letter to one of the other great commentators of the time, David Kimchi. Kimchi was very much a Maimonidean thinker, and he traveled throughout France near the end of his life to rally those who followed Maimonides and to fight those who were trying to ban the study of Maimonides, because there were many rabbis in northern France, a much more traditional community, and those rabbis did want to ban Maimonides. Right? So here's this letter to Kimchi, and Al-Fakar writes back to Kimchi with kind of a critique of Maimonides' teaching about creation. And if you see something that is a little bit like what you saw in the previous text, the personal animus towards the philosopher, you'll definitely recognize it here. So what does he say? Maimonides says in the guide about the eternity of the world, if he had found in Aristotle a proof for eternity of the world that was cogent according to the rules of logic, he could have reinterpreted the verses allegorically in a manner different from their simple meaning, making them fit the doctrine that the world always existed. He did this with the terms image and likeness, which appear to indicate corporeality of God, meaning that God, seems to be ascribed to some physical nature. According to this approach, whenever a philosophical proof contradicts a biblical verse, we abandon the straightforward meaning of the verse. But he says there's no analogy to be made between the doctrine of eternity and the doctrine of corporeality. Because with corporeality, there are many verses that contradict each other. But about the doctrine of creation, all of the verses bear witness to the same thing, raising their voice in praise of the one who brought the world into being with the divine word, and therefore a proof from Greek philosophy cannot uproot them. Okay? Skipping down a little bit, therefore we have learned one cannot fulfill one's obligation by relying on Greek philosophy in matters of Torah, especially with regard to the proof for eternity, which would undermine the reason for the Sabbath. In other words, the whole idea of Shabbat is based on the idea that the world was created at a certain time in 6 days, and then the seventh day God rested. Right? So Maimonides' purpose is to refrain from deviating from the natural order of the world, wanted to make the Torah and Greek science cohabit under one tent, but the union is in reality mourning and moaning. The earth cannot bear their dwelling together like sisters. And he says, you, Kimchi, you should know that those who walk in darkness, clutching the guide for the perplexed, thinking they are wise, while they despise the word of the Lord and attain little wisdom, are indolent and unable to make up their minds. They think they have the best of both, but in reality, they have neither the light of Torah nor the reputation of true philosophers. You consider the guide to be a wonderful teacher. We view it as opening the door to rebelliousness. All right, the guide is not all bad, right? But attracted by its good parts, one is seduced by its bad. Would that this book had never come into being, never been translated, and never read, right? Etc. So that is pretty strong rebuke to the Maimonidean camp. Right? We're going to have to stop here. If you have questions, make a note of them, and we will we'll come back to deal with them next time. Thank you all very much, and we'll take a short break before our next class.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Excellent class.
Okay. Thank you all.
Very interesting.
Ignorance is bliss.
Thank you, Rabbi. I've enjoyed it.